My name is Pam Kleemann. I'm a Melbourne photographer and I'm the wife of the late Pasi Jo, the Congolese musician. The exhibition is called PJ Cool and it's on at St Vincent's Hospital Gallery in Melbourne. The name PJ Cool came about because of the initials Pasi Jo and because having been sick with cancer for the last 2.5 years, he spent the last almost year in his pyjamas. And so pyjamas in Australia, you know, the term PJs is used to refer to pyjamas. So it just seemed like a fun kind of title to have for the exhibition. And Joe is a very snappy, was a very snappy dresser, and you know, the cool tended to fit his personality and his style. Look, the response has been really overwhelmingly fantastic. I deliberately decided to have the exhibition at the hospital where Joe was a patient. He had all of his cancer treatment at St Vincent's Hospital, and they do have a gallery there, so it seemed appropriate that the work be shown in the place where he was taken care of. There's a comments book in the gallery, and people write often that the work is inspiring, it's life-affirming, it's celebratory. When people are in hospital, they tend to be a number and a name, and they have an illness. So they're not really defined by the person they were before they come to the hospital. So I really felt it was important for Pasi Jo's legacy to be known within the hospital setting. And the interesting thing about that was that the people who have cared for Joe during his illness, most of them have been to see the exhibition, and they were absolutely delighted to get to know him after his death. Saddened, but it gave them such pleasure as well, because not only do I have photographs of Pasi Jo while he was in the hospital, but there's also a cabinet of memorabilia that is really a showcase of what his life was as a person, as a three-dimensional person outside of the hospital setting. Okay, the concept for the exhibition really is based on the subcultural movement in Congo, which started in Brazzaville, called Le Sape. So it's a movement that's very much in tune with musicians, and it's about style and harmony. It's a kind of anti-establishment, pacifist movement. And Joe was very much a part of that culture, along with people like Papa Wemba and various other musicians, Kofi Olomide and others. So he was sitting in my office one day and wearing this pair of red and black and grey check pyjamas. And I just looked at him and I thought, you know, Joe, let's do a series of photographs of you dressed in pyjamas like they are designer suits, and we'll dress you up with the accoutrements that go with the sapeur movement. Walking sticks, sunglasses, bags, you know, all of the things that make up that style. And he was really into the idea because Joe loved being in front of the camera as a performer. He really, really shone on stage, and so he was very willing to collaborate with me on this project. I was not certain if we would be able to do it in the hospital, but I thought that would be a really interesting juxtaposition, because normally followers of Le Sape are photographed in the street, swaggering, swanning around and looking fabulous. So I thought the hospital setting would be a really interesting or a different take on the narrative, if you like, of that story and that part of Joe's life. To look at the photographs, you would have no idea that this man is sick. You know, he was enormously proud, and he strived very hard to maintain his dignity throughout the illness. And what it meant for him was bringing his culture into the hospital. And it was a delightful thing to witness, because the hospital is very depressing. It doesn't have much colour, and these are not the usual kind of photographs of a sick person. So they're very much about celebrating culture and identifying somebody by their culture rather than the illness, which was cancer. So that was my premise for doing the exhibition. We met probably about 23 years ago. I had recently moved to Melbourne, and through associations with different people, I met Pasi Jo, and I ended up becoming his publicity photographer for a number of years. So we had been friends for a very long time, and you know, with the music and my love of African music drew me into this friendship with this remarkable man who was enormously talented and travelled the world spreading joy through his music. Jo comes from a family of Balari troubadours. His mother was a singer. She was part of a troupe that would go around from place to place singing about life, you know, for weddings, for christenings, for engagements, for funerals, various rites of passage. So Jo had had that influence in his life, and music had always been a part of his life. As a child, he told me this wonderful story where he and his friends would sneak out when he was about 12 or 13 and go down the street and peer in the windows of the nightclubs, watching the musicians perform and listening to the music. And he would say to himself all the time, one day it's going to be me on these stages. Pasi Jo came to Melbourne with Chico Chikaya in 1990, and they did a couple of gigs, one I think at the Hilton Hotel, one at the Moreland Hotel, and that was Jo's introduction to Australia, and he really loved it. So from then he was toing and froing from between Australia and France, because by that stage he was living in Paris and had lived in Paris for 10 years and had a #1 hit with his band Cas. And he eventually relocated to Australia in the mid-90s, and with Chico formed his Australian band Warako Musica. They were only going for 2 years before they won Best World Music Act at the Australian Music Foundation Awards here in Melbourne. The music is essentially rumba, soukous, Afrobeat, Latin combination. It's very danceable, it's very vibrant, very sensual dance moves, and Pasi Jo was an absolutely immaculate musician in terms of his timing and his rhythm. It was absolutely stunning, and seeing the band on stage, it was just absolutely so infectious, and they got people dancing in no time. That band did very well. They've done probably every festival in Australia over the years. When pubs began to close and pokie machines were introduced into pubs, a lot of the really good venues in Melbourne closed, and the whole music scene changed in the late 90s, early 2000s, and there wasn't as much money to pay big bands, so things became much harder for Jo. But he constantly maintained his band, and they did very well over the time that they were performing in Melbourne. Interesting question. The challenge for Jo was maintaining the band after Chico left. You know, Chico and Jo really drove the band, and one of the things that Jo found really difficult was teaching Australian musicians the rhythms that were required for this music. And he would often say to me, you know, I taught these musicians this same music 2 weeks ago and now they've forgotten it. So he really strove very hard to make sure that they were absolutely spot on with the music. And, you know, certainly getting gigs was a challenge. Jo didn't have a manager. He had an agent for a while, but that didn't continue for all of the time. So he was finding his own gigs. He was, you know, organising the rehearsals. He was writing the material and doing it all, and that can be very problematic when you are the master of everything. So it was a bit of a struggle. There wasn't the money to pay big bands any longer, which was also very difficult. But you know, in the true professional that he was, he sailed through all of that pretty well, and the band continued to get audiences. Much later in his career here in Melbourne, he was invited by Seesaw Films to have a small role in a film called Slow West. The director of that film, John McLean, who's also a musician, was looking for a Congolese musician for this particular part in this film, which was a love story set in the 19th century. And so John McLean came to our apartment in Brunswick and heard Joe sing. Essentially, Joe was auditioning for this part, and he practically cried when Joe sang this really, really beautiful song. And so Joe got the part immediately, and he was flown in October in 2013 to New Zealand to perform an original song called Mbanza Congo with two other African musicians who were located in New Zealand as well. So that was a really big achievement for Joe. Soon after that, you know, we received the cancer diagnosis in the middle of 2014, so he only performed once after the cancer diagnosis. He had been through chemotherapy, radiotherapy, major surgery, and you know, he did lose his confidence for a little while. But we did a benefit gig for him at the end of November in 2015, and that was the first time he performed. And I know he was really terrified of performing, but he just sailed through, and it absolutely again looked like there was nothing wrong with him. It's really interesting. I will never forget the day we got his cancer diagnosis. It was on the 16th of July in 2014. And one of the first things he said to me was, "Africans don't get cancer." And I was fascinated by that, because clearly he was a living example of Africans getting cancer. And I had a conversation with one of the media people at St Vincent's Hospital, and he said he has talked to African people, and he said that's a very common response, which I hadn't been aware of at all. So it really threw him, this diagnosis. And he struggled with this idea of impending mortality, which is something we all have to struggle with, I guess, you know. And in the end, all we have is time, regardless of whether we've been diagnosed with a possible terminal illness or not. We have time, and we've got to make the best of that time. So the hospital would never give us a period, a kind of an umbrella period of time of how much time there might be. They're very hesitant to do that. So we just had to make every day count, if you like, which sounds a bit of a cliche, but you've got to live in the present when something like that's going on. So we decided that we were going to go back to Brazzaville, because he hadn't been back home for almost 25 years. So it was like this odyssey that we were doing. I had finished my work for the year. It was going to be winter in Europe and, you know, boiling steamy hot in Congo. But it was just the time to go, and we really just had to act on the spur of the moment. So we did this trip. We were away for 6 weeks, and we went to Paris for a week, then to the Congo for 2 weeks, and then back to Paris, Germany, UK, so that Joe could reconnect with his family and some of the musicians who were in his very first band, Super Boboto. We went to one of the nightclubs where Super Boboto had played. There was a fantastic band playing absolutely gorgeous rumba with an amazing guitarist, and the mayor got up and gave Joe this fantastic welcome to him back in Brazzaville. That was a very, very special trip for Joe, because he was able to see his family again and reconnect with them and let them know what was going on. He was able to visit his mother's grave for the first time, and seeing all of the musicians in Paris, Sirin Benza, Wutamei, people from Cascas, Bhopal, all of those people. It was, for me, it was a family trip and a trip about friendship. And I was introduced to all of those people, and they were incredibly welcoming and warm towards me, and thought that, you know, Pasi Jo was in good hands, essentially. And it was both a wonderful trip and it was a tragic trip too, because we had no way of knowing if Jo would ever walk on the Congolese soil again, if he would ever walk the streets of Paris again. And I've never heard him laugh so much. It was like that trip extended his life, and it really gave him a reason to keep holding on. The doctors had also said that it was probably time for him to have a break from chemotherapy. So all of the signs were pointing to the fact that this was a really, really good idea to travel, and to, again, just be immersed in family and friendship. So everything was pointing to the possibility of this trip, you know. I had finished work. The doctors had said it would be really good for Jo to have a break from chemotherapy. So we flew out of Melbourne on this fantastic trip. And I do strongly believe that that trip extended Jo's life, because he had absolutely brilliant reason to keep living, to keep holding on, to see people he hadn't seen for many, many, many years. He'd spoken on the phone always, but it was just fantastic to see how warmly he was received back in the arms of his family, back in the arms of his friends. And I've never seen him laugh so much in such a long time, and it was just so joyful to experience the rapport that was still there after so many years of not being together. He was absolutely still holding on until the last minute. He never once gave up. And he'd more or less stopped going out, but we still had people coming to visit him. And he was still teaching the musicians new songs. He had 3/4 recorded a new album, which I will finish this year. So he never gave up on music, and he never gave up on life. It was not uncommon for me to see him sitting up at the kitchen table at 3 o'clock in the morning, still singing into his little Panasonic analog tape recorder and writing song lyrics on little bits of paper. He was an absolute musician until the end. And even on the afternoon of his death, he sang in the hospital room, which was both excruciatingly painful and exhilarating to see that, you know, someone so still had the courage and the bravery and the wherewithal to sing. And it was a heartbreaking moment, absolutely, but it was a moment that really showed who he was and what his life was dedicated to. Because when he came to Australia, he didn't tell people about his musical journey from the Congo to Paris, touring the world playing music, to the Americas, to South America, touring with Pepe Kale, touring with so many fantastic musicians, playing with Sam Mangwana, playing with Mose Fan Fan. He really started at the bottom here in Australia. And it was interesting for me because when I talked to some of the musicians, people like Conrad Henderson, so what surprised me really was that the musicians who Jo was working with knew very little about his previous history as a musician and the fact that he had travelled the world, toured Africa many times, toured America, toured South America, played all over Europe, UK. And he hadn't actually given that story to any of the musicians. So he really started at the bottom here and worked his way up in a way that was in many ways, quite humbling, I think. He wasn't he didn't have a big ego. So he wasn't out there pushing what he'd done, and sort of bragging about it in a sense. So when I spoke to the musicians about, did you know this about Joe or did you know that about that, they would shake their head and say, no, he hasn't told us that. So I found that really interesting, that there was that humility about him as a musician. And he was also a very private person as well, which, I have a very high regard for. The Pasi Jo story will continue. I will finish the album. Pasi Jo had wanted to, in many ways, reinvent himself, and we'd had discussions about a possible new name that he might work under, and we come up with the name Black Boris. Boris was a nickname that he had in Congo, and we kind of had this joke about, oh, well, let's call you Black Boris and see. It's a bit politically incorrect, but Joe was a bit irreverent and he had quite a wacky sense of humour, which was a lot of fun. So the new album will actually be under the banner of Black Boris and Tukavana. And then there will be a second CD of Joe's side projects. He had been working with a string quartet. He had been working with a combination African-Australian choir called Jabula. He had done the song for the film Slow West, and he had recorded a bit of instrumental music with fellow Melbourne musician Kenny Lopez. So I've been uncovering all of this really beautiful, almost folkloric music, quite different to the other recording, which again is, Latino Afrobeat, Rumba Soukous album. With the exhibition, I hope to take it to Shepparton, where there's a significant Congolese community. It will go to Sydney as part of the Head-On Photographic Festival. It will probably travel to Adelaide, to the Light Gallery at the Centre for Creative Photography in Adelaide. And I would like to see it go to Paris and to London as well. So I'm hoping to keep Pasi Jo's touring schedule alive through the exhibition. And certainly his legacy will continue with the music, with the new album. So I will certainly be promoting that.